Is recognized.
President, I ask consent to speak for as long as for up to 15 minutes on two subjects.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today, first of all, to address the important legislation pending before this body, S. 3414, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012. I've followed this debate and want to compliment particularly Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins and Senator Rockefeller, Senator Feinstein, and folks like Senator Kyle and Senator Whitehouse who've been trying to find some common ground in this area. And I hope at some point in the next day or so we will be able to proceed to this bill and have it fully debated. I think many senators bring different levels of expertise to this issue. I hope my voice, as someone who spent 20 years in the technology field and in telecom in particular before I entered government service, and somebody who's had the honor in the 3.5 years I've been in this body to serve on the Intelligence Committee, the Commerce Committee, and the Banking Committee, three of the committees that all immediately intersect with the challenges around cyber, can add a bit of my perspective to this debate. Let me start with where some of the concerns that have been raised by some of the opponents to this legislation have focused, that can, in this area around cyber, how do we make sure we have appropriate information sharing? How do we set some standards? Who should enforce those standards? Because I think most all of us looked into this area would recognize it's not a question of when we're going to have a major cyber attack, or if we're going to have a major cyber attack. It's only a question of when. Matter of fact, we are already, as has been reported in the press in a number of fashions, attacked daily by foreign agents, criminal elements, hackers that are constantly probing our country's cyber defenses on both the public and private side. And one of my reasons why I think it is so appropriate that we move on this legislation and soon is that I have great fears that when we have a major cyber element or cyber attack, that as in the reaction to that attack, Congress may, as they've done so many times in the past, overreact because we didn't take action before something that we knew was imminent would be taking place. So I do think this piece of legislation, and candidly I could have supported even a stronger piece of legislation, is a great first step in this area. I'm going to come back in a moment to some amendments that I hope to offer to this legislation, because to deal with some of the concerns that other members have raised and other folks have raised on this issue. But let's talk about again why we need cyber legislation and why we need it now. Inaction is not a solution. Every national security expert, from not just the current administration, but previous administrations, and most members of Congress agree that the status quo is not sustainable. Over a 5-month period between October 2011 and February 2012, there were 50,000 cyber attacks on private and government networks. And we're told between 2009 and 2011, attacks on U.S. infrastructure increased by a factor of 17. And as more and more nations and rogue actors get more sophisticated computer and technology knowledge, these numbers are going to exponentially grow. And as the FBI has said, cyber espionage, computer crime, and attacks on critical infrastructure will surpass terrorism as the #1 threat facing the United States. Think how many things we have done appropriately, the previous administration and this administration, in terms of homeland security to protect our nation against the threat of terrorists. We now have the director of the FBI saying the cyber threat will soon surpass terrorism in terms of a threat to our nation. I know as a former business guy that we're already seeing manifestations of this threat in other areas. Intellectual property theft is one of the most insidious threats we face right now. A former FBI agent who specialized in counterintelligence and computer intrusion was quoted as saying that in most cases, companies don't realize they've been burned until years later when a foreign competitor puts out their very same product, only making it at 30% cheaper. We've already lost our manufacturing base in many ways. Are we really prepared by not putting appropriate cyber protections in place to lose our R&D base as well? I know there are some who say, well, cyber is different. Well, cyber is different in certain ways, but in many ways it's similar. Just as we would never have a nuclear facility without guards and a wall and a fence, or I see my good friend, the senator from Louisiana, we would never have power facilities or levees without appropriate protections. How is it that we would not have some level of standards and information sharing of threats that are coming in amongst not only our public sector entities, but our private sector entities as well? Matter of fact, as a former business guy, I have been surprised at some of the resistance from some business organizations who are saying this requirement of both information sharing and some minimum standards would actually be a burden on business. I actually, in many ways, think somewhat the opposite, because there are a number of businesses right now that have taken the responsible step, put in place significant cyber protections. And competitors in their industry, because they're not taking those putting those same protections in place, are actually free riders on the system. Yet when, not if, but when we have a major cyber event, if one of those folks, one of those companies who have not put appropriate protections in place end up causing dramatic harm to our economy or to that industry sector, all the industries, all the businesses in that sector will one way or the other end up paying the price. Again, one of the reasons why we need both this information sharing and some level of standards. Now, I know to try to move forward in terms of actual standards or mandatory standards, we're not going to have that at this point. And that we have set up a measure, and again, want to commend Senator Kyle and Senator Whitehouse for working through what I think is a pretty darn good compromise, where there would be an industry group that would develop, in effect, best practices, because agreeably it is hard for government and with bureaucracy moving so slow to keep up, particularly with something like technology, but would allow a industry group to come up with, in effect, best practices. And those companies that adhere to those best practices would actually would receive legal and other protections, so that we could encourage folks to make sure that we have in place the kind of protections that all industries and our country needs. Now, to make clear, though, that we don't have mandatory standards, we have put in place, and let me just make sure I've got my pages here on the right level. I've been working with Senator Snowe on a couple of amendments, and I believe there are other members who will join us on at least one of these amendments. The first amendment is very important, and hopefully will go some distance in terms of clarifying one of the issues that seems to be a major subject of debate in this legislation. And that is to modify, and again, working with the chairs of the committee, we may even move beyond this modification to elimination, but to modify a key section of the bill, Section 103, by making clear that the standards set by this bill for the protection of infrastructure are indeed voluntary. This amendment makes it clear that this bill does not in any way alter the authority of any federal agency to regulate the security of critical infrastructure. Again, there were some concerns that there might have been a mistake in the earlier draft. This amendment makes clear that the standards that are developed by industry working groups will be voluntary, and that nothing in this legislation will allow any federal agency to regulate the security of critical infrastructure. I believe this amendment should alleviate the concerns of some that the bill might put in place mandatory standards for infrastructure protection. Again, despite the very clear language that already exists in the bill that standards are voluntary. It is my understanding that this amendment will be considered as part of a broader set of solutions negotiated by Senator Lieberman, and whether our amendment comes forward or whether it is broadened in a manager's package, I hope it will clarify this portion of the debate about mandatory versus voluntary. Voluntary is a good first step. The fact that this will be developed by industry working groups, the fact that this will not be subject to the lagging time of government bureaucracy or rulemaking, hopefully will move us in the right direction. A second amendment, one that, again, working with Senator Snowe on, that's a bit more technical, but particularly for my colleagues on the Commerce Committee, I hope we'll be able to gain some support, seeks to ensure that the authority provided to DHS to sole source highly specialized products will result in the procurement of interoperable standards-based products and services whenever possible. What does that mean in English? It means that when government goes out, and particularly during sole sourcing of a solution set, too often, I've seen this in my old industry of telecom years in and years out, people will develop a particular product or solution that works for that company's only set of standards, and when the government subsequently or other private sector entities go on and buy or replace or expand whatever particular system, if it's not interoperable with the rest of the telecommunication system or the rest of the network, then we're really not getting value for our dollar. Again, this is a small issue in the context of cybersecurity, but both Senator Snowe and I believe it is important for the purpose of competition, and it should lower the overall cost of key technologies and services for the taxpayer. So, Mr. President, as I close on my first comments, I do hope that we'll be able to move forward before the break on the question of cybersecurity. I think great progress has been made in the negotiations. I know there's a lot of issues that remain to be resolved, but I would reinforce what so many other colleagues have already said. It's not a question of if we're hit by a cyber attack. It's only a question of when in terms of a major incident. Let's get ahead of the game. Let me take two